The chains was not iron. Isadora Kingsley realized this the moment she grabbed them, her fingers burning instantly where the black metal kissed her skin. Not iron, something older, something that hummed with a frequency she could feel behind her teeth, behind her eyes, in the marrow of bones she hadn't known could ache. She yanked her hands back and stared at the figure bound to the stone column in the center of the chamber, and she understood, with a clarity that cut straight through 3 months of running and hiding and surviving on nothing but sheer stubborn will, that she had stumbled into something catastrophically larger than herself. The man chained to that column was not a man at all. He was tall, even restrained, his body carrying the kind of authority that didn't require movement to communicate. His skin was the white of fresh snowfall, luminous in the low torchlight of the underground chamber, and his hair fell across his forehead in silver strands that belonged to no age and every age simultaneously. His jaw was cut like old architecture. His eyes, when they opened at the sound of her presence, were the deep arterial red of a dying star, and they fixed on her with an intelligence so ancient it pressed against the inside of her skull like a second heartbeat. The chains around his wrists and throat were inscribed with runes she'd never seen outside of the books she'd been trying very hard to forget she'd ever read. Blood law runes, the kind that could only be cast by another member of the vampire nobility. The kind that required not just power but a betrayal so profound it shook the old world codes at their foundation. Someone had trapped the Vampire King. You, he said, and his voice was a low, controlled thing, like thunder choosing not to break, are not one of Casimir's people. No, Isadora said, and she was proud that her voice didn't shake. She'd had a lot of practice lately at saying things steadily while her entire world came apart. I'm nobody, I'm just passing through. Nobody does not pass through the undercroft of Vethis. His red eyes tracked her with an unsettling calm. Nobody breaks through the ward seals on that door without either significant magical training or an extraordinary amount of blind luck. Which are you? She looked at the door she'd come through, which had been sealed with what she'd thought was just a very sophisticated electronic lock, until the metal had rippled beneath her hands like a living thing and simply opened for her, as if recognizing something she herself hadn't consented to being recognized. She thought about the last 3 months. She thought about the man who had died telling her to run. She thought about the envelope he'd pressed into her hands with his last breath, the one she still hadn't opened because she was terrified of what it would confirm. Extraordinary luck, she said. Something shifted in those ancient eyes, not quite amusement, not quite sorrow, something that had no modern equivalent. Then extraordinary luck, said the Vampire King, has sent you to either save me or die with me. In approximately 47 minutes, Casimir Vreth will return to finish what he started. If you cannot remove these chains before then, we will both be consumed by the unraveling he has prepared for this room. Isadora stared at him. She thought about leaving. She genuinely, seriously, considered turning around and walking back out through the door that had recognized her and putting as much city between herself and whatever this was as her legs could manage. Then she thought about the man who had died telling her to run, and how he had also spent the last 6 years of his life trying to teach her that running was never actually the answer. She looked at the chains. Tell me everything about those runes, she said, and don't leave anything out. 3 months earlier, Isadora had been a graduate student in medieval European linguistics at Blackwell University, which was a perfectly ordinary thing to be. Her life had been small and organized and satisfying in the way that quiet lives sometimes were, full of old books and black coffee, and the particular pleasure of translating something ancient that no one had understood for centuries. She had a desk covered in papers. She had a cat named Ptolemy, who knocked those papers onto the floor every single morning with an expression of complete serenity. She had an advisor named Professor Aldrich, who smelled faintly of something she'd never been able to identify, and who had been, for the past 6 years, the closest thing she had to family. When Professor Aldrich had been found dead in his office at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, the university had called it a heart attack. Isadora had known immediately that it was not a heart attack. She'd known because the window of his third-floor office had been broken from the outside in, because the books on his shelves had been pulled out and thrown across the room in a pattern that suggested a very rapid and very targeted search, and because tucked inside the front cover of the medieval manuscript she'd been working on translating, wrapped in a piece of paper with her name on it in Aldrich's handwriting, was an envelope she'd shoved into her coat pocket and run with before the police arrived. She'd been running since. The envelope had stayed sealed in the inside pocket of that coat, worn against her chest like armor or like evidence, while she moved through rented rooms and borrowed couches and one very memorable week in the back office of a 24-hour laundromat in exchange for working nights. She'd learned to spot the men who were following her, and she'd learned they were not men in the conventional sense, though they wore the shape convincingly enough in bad light. She'd learned the signs: the pale skin that never flushed, the eyes that caught light incorrectly, the way they always positioned themselves between her and exits without seeming to be aware they were doing it. She'd learned that vampires were real. Aldrich, she suspected, had known this for a long time. She suspected the envelope would confirm it. She was waiting until she was somewhere safe enough to survive the confirmation. She had not, in 3 months, found anywhere safe enough. Then she had fallen through a ward seal into an underground chamber beneath the old financial district, following a map she'd found scratched into the inside cover of a library book she'd borrowed on a whim, and she'd found the Vampire King in chains, and the concept of safe had quietly excused itself from the conversation. His name was Zarek Ivoryn. He told her this while she worked on the chains, her linguistics background proving unexpectedly useful, because the runes were written in a dialect of Prothic script she'd spent the better part of her second year of graduate school trying to decode, and the fact that she could actually read the inscription around the manacles made the color drain from his already pale face in a way she found grimly satisfying. "You can read that," he said. It was not quite a question. Prothic derivative, late Second Age, with some later additions that have been modified. She turned the manacle as much as she could without touching the metal directly, reading the inscription by the light of her phone. Whoever wrote this was working from an incomplete source text. There are errors, gaps in the binding structure. "Casimir is brilliant but impatient," Zarek said, and his voice carried a weight that was not just frustration, but something older, the particular pain of a betrayal by someone trusted. He spent 3 centuries studying the binding arts and never completed the final sequences because he decided he already knew enough. He was wrong, Isadora agreed. This phrase here, this is supposed to activate the pain induction layer of the binding, but he's used the second-person reflexive where he needed the impersonal which means it's directing the induction back at the caster every time it tries to fire rather than at you. She looked up at him. Is that why you're not screaming? Something moved through his expression that she couldn't read, partially. What's the other part? I am the Vampire King, he said simply, as though this explained everything. Then, after a pause that suggested he recognized it didn't, I have endured worse than this, and I will not give Casimir the satisfaction of hearing me. Isadora filed this away under things about Zarek Ivoryn that are both admirable and deeply concerning, a category she suspected was going to need a great deal of space. She went back to the runes. The binding was layered in 7 sequences, each one keyed to a different aspect of vampire physiology and power, and removing them required not just reading the inscription, but understanding the harmonic structure beneath it, the way each layer resonated with the ones adjacent to it, and the way disrupting one without accounting for the others would cause the whole structure to collapse inward. Collapsing inward, the inscription cheerfully noted in its archaic script would result in the immediate and catastrophic unraveling of the bound individual's fundamental essence, which was, as far as Isadora could translate, a very clinical way of describing destruction. She worked methodically, speaking the counter-sequences aloud under her breath, the way she always had when working through a difficult translation, testing each phrase against the resonance she could feel in the air of the chamber. The runes responded to her voice. She didn't question this. She was filing the question under things she would deal with after they were not about to be destroyed. You have 20 minutes, Zarek said quietly. I know. She found the 7th sequence and stopped. This one is different. Yes. She read it again, then she looked at him. This one isn't keyed to your physiology. No. His red eyes held hers steadily. It is keyed to a blood offering, a voluntary one. From a human with Verani lineage. The silence between them was very loud. Aldrich, Isadora said slowly. Aldrich Verani. Your professor was my oldest human ally, Zarek said, and the grief in his voice was quiet and devastating. The grief of someone who had had millennia to learn to carry loss without showing it, and had not entirely succeeded in this instance. He was the last of the Verani line. His family has kept the keys to the old blood laws for 400 years. Casimir killed him to prevent exactly what you are about to do. He left me the envelope, Isadora said. The one I haven't opened yet, I know. At her expression, Aldrich sent me word when he knew they were coming for him. He said he had sent you ahead with the key. I did not know he meant it quite so literally. Isadora stood very still for a moment. She was thinking about a dead man who had been kind to her for 6 years, and who had spent those 6 years preparing her for something she hadn't known she was being prepared for. She was thinking about how the runes had responded to her voice. She was thinking about the envelope still sealed against her chest. She was thinking about the fact that in approximately 17 minutes, something called an unraveling was going to arrive, and the only thing standing between it and a very powerful, very chained vampire king was a graduate student in medieval linguistics who had just learned her bloodline was 400 years old. What does the blood offering require, she asked. A drop, he said. Freely given. Press to the 7th rune while the counter-sequence is spoken. He paused, and for the first time she saw something in his expression that was not controlled or ancient or regal. I need you to understand that I cannot compel you to do this. The blood law would void the offering if it were compelled. It must be your choice. I understand. Isadora, her name in his mouth, sounded different than it had ever sounded before. like a word from a language she'd always somehow known. If you do this, it creates a binding between us, not of chains, of debt and honor. Under the old world codes, I will owe you a life debt. That is not a small thing. I'm not doing it for the debt, she said. I know. Something shifted in his face, in the careful ancient architecture of it. Something that was new and not new. Something that had perhaps been waiting a very long time for the right moment to surface. I know you are not. She found her small pocket knife in her jacket. She pressed the blade to the pad of her index finger, quickly, before she could think about it too carefully. She pressed her bleeding finger to the 7th rune. She spoke the counter sequence. The chains fell. She had exactly 3 seconds to register that Zarek Ivoryn standing free and unbound was a fundamentally different experience than Zarek Ivoryn in chains, in the same way that a storm is a fundamentally different experience than a photograph of a storm. And then he moved, and the word moved was barely adequate, because it implied something sequential, and what he did was simply appear elsewhere, between her and the door, at the far end of the chamber, which had just opened. Casimir Vreth was not what she'd expected. She'd expected someone who looked like a villain, because 3 months of running from people trying to kill her had built a certain expectation in her mind. Casimir was tall and elegant in a dark suit, with white hair swept back from a face that was classically beautiful in the cold, architectural way that sometimes belonged to paintings in museums that no one stood in front of long enough to actually see. His eyes were a pale violet, the color of something faded, and they moved from the empty chains to Zarek to Isadora with an expression that went through several emotions very quickly before settling on something that was trying very hard to be composed. Zarek, he said, you look well considering. Casimir. Zarek's voice was the quietest it had been since Isadora had met him, which made it the most dangerous it had been, the way the deepest water is always the stillest at the surface. 312 years. I gave you 312 years of trust, and I gave you 312 years of service, while you played king and made peace with the humans who killed our kind for sport. Casimir's composed expression cracked slightly, and what was underneath it was old and scorched and very sincere. The old world codes are chains too, Zarek. You simply chose not to see it. The old world codes are what keep us from destroying everything we touch, Zarek said, which is what you are about to discover when the full court hears of this betrayal. The full court. Casimir almost smiled. Half the full court funded this. Did you think you could hold the throne for 4 centuries without building enemies? Did you think your tolerance for humans and your ancient vows and your blood laws would last forever? No, Zarek said. I thought they would last long enough for the right human to find me. His eyes moved briefly to Isadora, and it was the briefest thing, a touch of red light, but Casimir saw it. Casimir looked at Isadora with new attention, the kind that made her want to step backward, which she did not do. The Varani girl, he said softly. I killed the old man too slowly. He had time. He had exactly enough time, Isadora said, and was genuinely surprised by how steady her voice was. That was the point of him. Something happened very fast after that. Casimir moved, and Zarek moved, and the chamber became a very small space for the kind of power that was suddenly occupying it, and Isadora threw herself behind the stone column, where Zarek had been chained, and pressed her back to it, and pulled out her phone, and did something she'd been waiting 3 months to do. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded piece of paper, covered in Aldrich's familiar cramped handwriting, and a small vial of something that glowed with a soft silver light, stoppered with black wax. The letter was written in Prothic script, which told her everything she needed to know about how certain Aldrich had been that she would be in exactly this moment. Reading exactly this letter, it said, "The unravelling is not Casimir's weapon, my dear. He borrowed it from the Vathis grimoire without understanding its fundamental nature. It does not destroy what it touches. It returns everything to its source. The vial contains the key phrase, rendered in liquid form, which only a Verani voice can activate. If you speak the phrase on the inner seal of this paper while holding the vial, the unravelling will turn around. Everything Casimir has set in motion will return to him. Forgive me for not telling you sooner. I needed you to come to this moment without the weight of knowing what you were carrying. I love you very much. Burn this afterward." Isadora read the inner seal. The phrase was 3 words in a language so old it had no name she knew, and when she spoke them, the vial in her hand dissolved into silver light that spread up her arm and across the chamber like a sunrise running backward, and Casimir Vreth stopped moving. The light washed over him, and he made a sound that was not quite pain and not quite grief, and not quite anything that had a human word. And then the unravelling he had spent the better part of a year preparing in this chamber rose up from the floor like a tide and flowed directly toward its architect, and Casimir Vreth was unmade in precisely the way he had intended to unmake Zarek Ivoryn. The chamber was very quiet afterward. Isadora became aware that she was shaking, which was reasonable, and that Zarek was standing in front of her, which she had not noticed him move to do, positioned between her and the space where Casimir had been, which she found she had opinions about, mostly involving the word unnecessary, and also the word thank you in no particular order. "Are you hurt?" he asked. No, she looked at her hand where the vial had dissolved. "Are you?" He looked down at himself as though this were a novel question. "No." "Right." She folded Aldrich's letter carefully, and then, because she'd been explicitly asked to, burned it with the lighter she kept in her jacket pocket for birthday candles and also, apparently, for this. "So," she said, watching the paper catch and char and go to ash in her palm, "I rescued you." The Vampire King looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, finally, and the word came out of him like something he had not expected to say and was not entirely sure what to do with. "You did." The world above the undercroft of Vethis was a city going about its midnight business, indifferent to everything that had just happened beneath its foundations. Rain had started while they were underground, the kind of steady autumn rain that made the streetlights bleed gold and orange across the wet pavement, and Isadora walked through it because she needed the air and the ordinary sounds of traffic and distant music from somewhere that sounded like a bar. Zarek walked beside her. He was wearing the ruin of what had been a very expensive suit, and his silver-white hair was loose around his face, and he walked with the particular quality of someone for whom the rain was simply a fact of the world and not an inconvenience, and he drew no attention from the 3 people they passed. Because there was something about him, she realized, that operated like a persuasion, a gentle frequency that made human brains file him under not important and move on. She was apparently immune to it. "You should have a place to go," he said. "A safe place. You've been running for 3 months. I've been managing. You've been surviving. Those are not the same thing." He stopped walking, and because he stopped, she stopped too, and they stood in the rain on a street corner while a taxi went past and someone's upstairs neighbor was apparently having a dinner party. "I have a place. It's safe. The wards on it are older than this city. I appreciate the offer, Isadora said carefully, but I don't know you. He turned to look at her, and in the rain and the streetlight, his face was something out of the world's oldest art, bone-white and red-eyed and utterly unhuman, and somehow, impossibly, not frightening. You just freed me from a blood law binding using a dead language and your own blood in an underground chamber, while a 300-year-old coup was happening around you. I think we are somewhat past not knowing each other, she considered this. That's fair. Additionally, he said, Casimir may be gone, but Casimir was not alone. He told you himself that half the court funded what he did. Those people are still there. They know what you did. They know what you are. His voice did not rise, but something in it deepened. You are not safe anywhere in this city that I do not make safe. You owe me a life debt, she said. Is this you paying it? The life debt requires me to offer my life in exchange for the one you preserved. What I'm offering now is something less dramatic and more practical. A pause. Although I would offer my life as well if that became relevant. Isadora looked at him for a long moment, standing in the rain outside an underground chamber where she'd unmade a centuries-old coup with a dead man's letter and her own blood, and thought about how nothing in her life before 3 months ago had prepared her for any of this, and how nothing in her life before 6 years ago had prepared her for Aldrich, and how it turned out that preparation was frequently a thing that happened to you, while you thought you were doing something else entirely. Show me the place, she said. His name was Zarek Ivoryn, and he was 4,000 and some years old, and the place he took her to was the top 3 floors of a building in the old quarter of the city that looked from the outside like a beautifully maintained, but entirely private, historical property, and was on the inside the kind of space that existed in the overlap between old world, palace and contemporary home. All dark wood and high ceilings and genuine medieval architecture wrapped around modern comforts with an unself-consciousness that suggested the person living here had simply never stopped accumulating things from every century as they passed through it. He showed her a room with a window that looked out over the rain-wet city and a lock on the door that was, he told her, keyed to her blood, now in the same way the Undercroft seal had been, and that no one would be able to enter it without her explicit consent, except in the event of a genuine emergency, at which point the wards would override. What qualifies as a genuine emergency, she asked. If something is trying to kill you and you're not able to open the door yourself, he said, with the directness of someone who had spent enough centuries watching people die of preventable things that he had no patience left for being delicate about it. And you, she said, would you be able to open it? He looked at her steadily. Yes, I am the only one who can override the blood key in this building. I will not use that unless I have to. His expression was very serious in the way that old things were serious, not performatively but fundamentally, like a law of physics. I want you to be safe here. I do not want you to feel imprisoned here. These are different things, and both of them are true. Isadora sat on the edge of the bed in the room with the city view, and thought about the difference between a cage and a shelter, and about how you could usually tell which was which, by who held the key and what they did with it. Thank you, she said. She slept for 12 hours, and when she woke, Ptolemy was sitting on the foot of the bed. She stared at him. He blinked at her with the vast indifference of a cat who had clearly been transported by vampire means, and found the whole experience entirely acceptable. She went downstairs, and Zarek was sitting in a chair by a window that was heavily curtained against the approaching dawn. Reading something in a language she could almost but not quite identify, and a coffee appeared to be waiting for her on the table nearby, made exactly as she made it herself. "How do you know how I take my coffee?" she asked. "Your professor mentioned it once," he said. "I have an excellent memory." She sat down in the chair across from him and drank at Ptolemy, who had followed her down and was now investigating the bookshelves. "Tell me about Aldrich," she said, and he did. The story of Aldrich Verani and Zarek Ivoryn was, like all the stories that mattered, both very long and very simple. 400 years ago, a young nobleman's son with a gift for old languages had stumbled into a piece of vampire territory in the mountains of what was then a border region of an empire that no longer existed, and instead of running or dying, he had sat down with his notes and begun translating the inscriptions on the stones, and Zarek had found him there 3 days later, still translating, having apparently decided that dying was less important than finishing the work. Zarek had not killed him. He had, in fact, sat down across from the young man and pointed out 3 significant errors in the translation, and they had argued about it for several hours, and something had been established in that argument that was not friendship in the way modern humans used the word, but was something perhaps more durable, a mutual recognition of quality, a respect that did not require either of them to be something other than what they were. The Verani family had become the keepers of the blood law keys, not servants, not subjects, allies, in the full old world meaning of the word, which carried obligations on both sides and had been honored for 400 years, and was now carried by the last member of the line, who was currently drinking coffee in Zarek's sitting room and watching his cat investigate a bookshelf that was largely organized by century. "He never told me any of this," Isadora said. "He was protecting you from it." Zarek turned a page without looking away from her. "He spent many years debating when to tell you. He decided that knowing too soon would make you into something careful and guarded, and that what you needed to be was what you were, curious and unafraid and very good at old languages. He was preparing me the whole time. Yes, that's either very wise or very manipulative. It is both," Zarek said, and the grief was back in his voice, quiet and contained and entirely real. Aldrich was both of those things. He was also the most genuinely good person I have known in 4,000 years, and I had hoped to know him for another 400. Isadora looked at him, at the controlled grief in his ancient face, and felt something shift in her own chest, because this was something she understood. The particular weight of loving someone across an impossible distance of time and nature, the way Aldrich had been mentor and father figure and mystery, all at once. And she felt for the first time since his death that she was with someone who understood exactly what she had lost. "Me too," she said quietly. They sat in the pre-dawn quiet, and it was not uncomfortable. The days that followed were full of things that needed doing, because the world did not pause for grief or for revelation, and because half a vampire court having funded a coup against their king was not a problem that resolved itself. Isadora learned things at a pace that would have been overwhelming if she hadn't already spent 3 months learning things at an overwhelming pace as a matter of survival. She learned the structure of the court of Ivoryn, which was not a single court, but a network of old-world vampire nobility, spread across several European cities, and anchored in the private levels beneath this one, meeting in spaces that looked from the outside like very exclusive members' clubs, and were from the inside something considerably more medieval. She learned the names of the 7 noble houses and which 3 had backed Casimir's coup and the complicated blood law history that had led them there. She learned the names of the ones who had not, who were loyal, who were grieving the betrayal in their own ancient, controlled, not quite human ways. She learned them because Zarek explained them to her in the evenings when the light was gone and he was at his most himself, animated and precise and occasionally darkly funny in ways she suspected were the product of having watched human civilization make the same mistakes at reliable intervals for 4 millennia. He explained things with the thoroughness of someone who had decided, in some quiet way, that she deserved to understand everything. She appreciated this more than she knew how to say. She also learned, in a more practical sense, that she was apparently not entirely human. This came up when she touched one of the blood law rune texts in Zarek's library, and the runes lit up in her hands warm and silver, the same silver as the vial Aldrich had left her. Zarek, who had been across the room, was beside her within one breath, looking at her hands with an expression of carefully managed intensity. "The Virani line," he said. "In the early generations, there was a mixing of blood before the laws that prohibited it were written. It was very long ago, and it only manifests in certain members of the line." "I'm part vampire," Isadora said. "No, not precisely." He sat down across from her, his red eyes steady on her face. The mixing was not vampiric blood, it was something older. Virani blood carries a resonance with the blood laws because the Virani line was present when the blood laws were first written. In the beginning. They were not just keepers of the keys. They were participants in the original covenant. He paused. "Aldrich's bloodline is older than my court." Isadora looked at her hands, which were completely normal, looking again now that she'd put the text down. Did Aldrich know? He knew the history. He did not know if it had manifested in you. He hoped it had. Zarek's voice was very quiet. "It is why Casimir killed him, and why Casimir wanted you. Not just to prevent the rescue, to take the power for himself." His jaw tightened in a way she'd learned to recognize as anger, controlled and absolute. "You were never in danger because of what you'd accidentally stumbled onto. You were in danger because of what you inherently are. That's worse." "Ah," she said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "I will not let it be what defines you. This is your choice to make. What you do with it. What you learn. What you allow to change." His expression was serious and very direct. "But you should know what you are. You deserve to know." She thought about knowledge. And about Aldrich, who had known so much and chosen so carefully when to share it, and about the 3 months she'd spent running from something she hadn't understood, and about how understanding never made a thing smaller, but it made it something you could hold. "Teach me," she said. So he did. The crisis came from the direction she hadn't anticipated, because crises, she was learning, always did. Lord Solvath Vrain was the eldest of the 3 Casimir-aligned noble houses, and he was not subtle about it. Where Casimir had been a strategist, working in shadows and patience, Solvath was something rawer, a believer in old-world force, in the principle that power demonstrated was power held. He arrived at the court with 30 of his household guard 2 weeks after Casimir's unmaking, and he made no pretense about why he was there. He stood in the great chamber beneath the city and announced, in the full formal register of old-world vampire address, that the throne of Ivoryn had been rendered invalid by the blood law breach of the Unraveling, and that the human female who had interfered in vampire internal affairs by using Virani blood magic against a noble-born vampire must be surrendered to vampire court law immediately. or Zarek Ivoryn would be considered in violation of the compact of Keseveth, which was, Isadora gathered from context, roughly equivalent to declaring him an outlaw from civilization. Isadora was in the gallery above the great chamber when this happened. She was there because Zarek had asked her not to be in the chamber itself, which she had agreed to, and she was watching from above, because she was not a person who agreed not to be present, and then simply went away and thought about something else. She watched Zarek stand in the center of the great chamber, with his hands clasped behind his back, and his silver-white hair loose over his shoulders, and his red eyes absolutely steady on Solveth Vrain, and he looked like the oldest and most dangerous thing in any room he had ever stood in, which she was increasingly convinced was simply what he was. Isadora Kingsley, Zarek said, acted under the ancient rite of the Varani covenant, which predates your house, Solveth, by 2,000 years. She used no vampire blood magic. She used the blood law resonance that is native to her line against a blood law binding in the preservation of the blood law covenant itself. Any court that interprets this as a violation has misunderstood the law so profoundly that I begin to question whether they have ever read it. She is human, Solveth said. She is Varani. The Varani line is extinct. Manifestly it is not. Zarek's voice did not rise, as you can see from the fact that Casimir's binding failed, which it could only have done through a legitimate Varani blood offering, which means either Isadora Kingsley is Varani, or the blood laws themselves performed the counter-sequence out of pure spite, which I am told they are capable of, but which seems unlikely in this specific case. There was a shifting in the chamber among the assembled nobles and their households, a quiet reassessment, and Isadora recognized the kind of argument that won not because it was louder, but because it was airtight, the kind Aldrich had taught her to construct. The compact of Keseveth, Solveth said. Shifting also requires the king to maintain the purity of the court's deliberations. You have housed a human. You have involved her in court affairs. You have allowed her access to blood law texts. The compact of Keseveth, said a new voice from the gallery, because Isadora had stepped to the railing, also contains a specific exemption for the Varani covenant keeper, who is granted standing in the court of Ivoryn as a non-voting member with full access to blood law materials by the terms of the original covenant, which is written in Prothic script in the third scroll of the Keseveth library, which I can provide a full translation of, if anyone in this room would like to read it. The great chamber was very quiet. Solveth Vrain looked up at her, and she looked back at him, and she did not look away, because she was Isadora Kingsley, who had translated medieval manuscripts in a dead language and run across 3 months of city and opened a dead man's letter in an underground chamber while an ancient evil was being unmade around her, and she had decided somewhere in the past 2 weeks that looking away from things that wanted to frighten her was a habit she was finished with. Solveth's pale, violet eyes flicked to Zarek. You allowed her to read the scrolls, he said, and there was something different in his voice now. I allowed her to read anything she chose to read, Zarek said. She chose the Keseveth scrolls on the 3rd day, which I had not suggested. She came to the same conclusions independently. A pause, and then, very quietly, she usually does. Solveth stood in the great chamber for a long moment, and whatever calculation was happening behind his faded violet eyes was complex, and she could not follow it. But she watched it resolve into something that was not quite defeat and not quite respect, but perhaps the precursor to both. The Vrain house acknowledges the Varani covenant keeper's standing, he said finally, formally, in the register of old world address that could not be unsaid once spoken. Under protest, noted, said Zarek, and then, to the chamber at large, in a tone that was utterly and completely final, this matter is closed. That night in the library, she found him at his desk, surrounded by the documents related to the 3 Casimir-aligned houses and the necessary formal proceedings of court censure and covenant renegotiation that were apparently going to occupy the next several months of his life. And she sat down across from him, and they worked in the same room in the way they'd been doing increasingly often, him with court documents, and her with the Varani covenant texts she was cataloguing, and it was quiet in the good way. After a while she said, "You knew I was in the gallery?" "Yes." "You didn't stop me?" "No." He set down his pen and looked at her, and his eyes in the lamplight were the deep red of old garnets. "I asked you not to be in the chamber because I wanted to handle the immediate confrontation before Solveth could make you a specific target. I did not ask you to be absent from the proceedings entirely because I did not think that was fair, and because," a very small pause, "I knew that if it became necessary, you would not need my permission to speak. You were relying on me," she said. He considered this. "I was aware that you were there and that your presence made a particular outcome significantly more likely." His expression was careful, as though he was navigating something. Whether that constitutes relying on you or simply trusting your judgment is perhaps a semantic question. "They're the same thing," she said. "Relying on someone and trusting their judgment are the same thing, Zarek. That's what trust is." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched something work through his expression, something that moved like a change in light, and she understood suddenly that this particular equivalence was something he had not quite allowed himself before, that relying on someone and trusting them were the same thing, and that both required a vulnerability he had spent 4,000 years not needing. "I spent a great deal of those years," he said carefully, "making certain that I did not need anyone." "I know. It is not," he said, a comfortable realization, discovering that one does. "No," she agreed, "but it's usually a sign that you've found someone worth it." The silence after that was different from the silences before. Fuller, she thought, warmer, the kind that was not the absence of something, but the presence of something that didn't need to be spoken yet. The formal court censure of the 3 Casimir-aligned houses took 11 weeks, and during those 11 weeks, Isadora's life became something she could not have constructed from the materials of her previous existence. She translated, she catalogued, she argued in formal Prothic script with vampire nobility who had not had their scholarship seriously challenged in several centuries, and who were sometimes furious about it, and sometimes, in the quiet aftermath of a lost argument, something that looked very much like relieved. She learned court protocols and old-world codes of honor and the complex web of obligations and debts and ancient vows that held vampire civilization together from the inside. And she found that it was not so different from human institutions fundamentally, except that the people who built it could remember building it, which gave the whole thing a particular weight. She had dinner with Zarek every evening, late, in the manner of someone who did not need to eat, but had decided that company at meals was worthwhile. She told him things about her previous life, about Blackwell University, and the papers and Ptolemy, and the particular joy of finding a translation that had defeated everyone else. And he listened with the entirety of himself in the way that very old people sometimes could, with all of their attention and none of their impatience, and he asked questions that demonstrated he had heard everything she'd said and found it interesting, and she thought, more than once, that being heard like that was an extraordinarily underrated thing. She told him once, in the library very late, that she had never had a relationship that didn't eventually make her feel like she was performing a version of herself that was more comprehensible to the other person than the actual one. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The actual one is the only one I have met, so I cannot compare. But I cannot imagine preferring a performance to this." She looked at him. He was looking at the book in his hands, not at her, which she thought was perhaps intentional, giving her the space to have the reaction she was having without the pressure of being observed in it. "Zarek," she said. He looked at her. "I think you should know," she said carefully, "that I have been trying very hard not to let what I'm feeling become a thing I need to say out loud, because I'm aware that we are in an extraordinarily unusual situation, and that there are power dynamics and a life debt and 4,000 years of difference between us. And I have been making a very reasonable case to myself that I should continue not saying it." He set his book down. His expression was very still in the way it got when something mattered to him. "But I'm also," she said, "apparently 400 years of lineage deep into a vampire covenant, and I unmade a blood curse with my bare hands, so I think reasonable is possibly not the framework I should be applying to my life anymore." He was quiet for a long moment, and she waited because she had learned to wait for him, learned that his silences were not absences but preparations. "I have spent 4,000 years, he said finally, being something that did not need saving or softening or accommodation, something that other people and other things arranged themselves around." His voice was very low. "I did not know that was loneliness until recently, until I had something to compare it to." She came around the table because she was done with the distance, and she stood in front of him, where he sat in his chair, and he looked up at her with those ancient red eyes that were not frightening to her, had not been frightening to her for a long time. And something in his face was so honest in that moment, so stripped of the centuries of careful composure, that she felt it like a physical thing. She put her hand against his face, against the bone-white jaw, and he closed his eyes briefly, like something settling, like something coming to rest after a very long journey. "Then you don't need to be alone with it anymore," she said. "Either of us do." He opened his eyes and looked at her, and he said her name, Isadora, in the way he said it, that sounded like a word from the language she'd always known, and then he stood, and the distance between them was gone, and he kissed her with the absolute thoroughness of someone who had decided something and would not be undecided. It was, she thought, somewhere in the warm cascade of it, like translating something that had finally become clear. The remaining business of the court took its time. The 3 censured houses submitted to formal renegotiation of their covenant terms, which involved lengthy proceedings in old Prothic formal address that Isadora translated simultaneously, sitting beside Zarek at the head of the court table, and writing as fast as her hand could manage. And Zarek had introduced her formally to the court at the beginning of those proceedings as the Verani, covenant keeper of the court Ivoryn, and no one in the chambers had challenged it, not even the censured houses, because the Solveth acknowledgment had been made in formal register and could not be revoked. Afterwards, Lord Decimos Curvath, who was the eldest of the loyal houses, and who had the measured quality of someone who had seen everything twice and maintained opinions about it, stopped her in the corridor outside the chamber and regarded her with his pale grey eyes for a long moment. "I knew the Virani line in the early generations," he said. "You have the look of them. I've been told they were extraordinary people." He was quiet for a moment. "Aldrich was the best of them. I was grieved to lose him." She thought about Aldrich, which she still did often, and which still hurt in the specific way that losing someone who loved you and was loved by you always does. Grief that was clean, because nothing about the relationship had been unfinished, even if the life had ended before she'd expected. "He knew what he was doing," she said. "He did it deliberately, and I think he chose it, and I hate that, and I'm also very grateful, and it's very complicated." Decimos Curvath considered her for another long moment. "The Virani were always very complicated," he said, and there was something in his ancient voice that was fond and rueful and respectful. It was among their most useful qualities. He inclined his head to her in the old world way that meant genuine acknowledgement. "Welcome to the court, Covenant Keeper." She inclined her head back in the manner Zarek had taught her. "Thank you, my lord." The last piece of unfinished business was, as last pieces often were, the simplest and the hardest. There was a formal court document, a blood law re-covenant, that needed to be signed and sealed under the old world codes before the Casimir affair could be considered formally closed, and the new terms of the 3 censured houses could take effect. The document required the signatures of the reigning lord of each affected house, the acknowledgement of the court's standing members, and the blood seal of the Virani Covenant Keeper. The blood seal required a blood offering, small and formal but freely given. Isadora stood at the head of the court table with the document before her, and Zarek standing at her right shoulder, and the assembled nobility of the court of Ivoryn arranged around the table, and she did not hesitate. She pressed her thumb to the document, and the runes in her blood lit silver, and the old world codes of the court of Ivoryn settled into their new configuration with a sound that was not quite a sound, more a sense of something vast and old breathing out. And then Decimos Curvath said, very quietly, "One more seal is needed, the king's." There was a brief, charged silence. "The king's seal on the Virani document," Zarek said, "has not been placed since the original covenant." 400 years ago, yes, Decimos said. "The original king placed his seal alongside the original Virani. It bonded the covenant at both ends." He was looking at Zarek with the expression of someone who had lived long enough to see patterns repeat and found them, in this instance, satisfying. "The covenant is stronger with it. It always was." Zek looked at the document. He looked at Isadora. She looked back at him. And she thought about bonds that were not chains, and about things that were chosen, and about the difference between being bound to someone and belonging with someone, and she thought about a dead man who had spent 6 years preparing her for a moment she was only now beginning to understand the full shape of. "Yes," she said softly. "Put your seal next to mine." He held her gaze for a moment, and in those ancient red eyes was something that was not calculated or composed or regal, something that was simply and completely his, and he pressed his hand to the document beside hers, and the silver light and the deep crimson light of his seal wound together like 2 rivers meeting, and the document sealed with a sound like the closing of something that had been open for a very long time. The court of Ivoryn was quiet. Then Decimos Curvath made a sound that was ancient and dry and deeply pleased, and Isadora thought very strongly that she might actually like him. In the months that followed, the city above and the court below found a new rhythm, and within it, Isadora and Zarek found theirs, She continued the translation work, building an archive of the Verani covenant texts that would endure beyond her human lifespan, which was a thought she'd had to sit with for a while before she could approach it practically. She had, it turned out, Prothic blood resonance that gave her a longer span than an ordinary human, exactly how much longer being a question she was not in a rush to definitively answer. Long enough, she had told Zarek when he had tried to have the conversation with the careful seriousness of someone who had watched too many people he cared about cease. Long enough he had not pushed it further, and she had understood this as both respect and as something he was also still sitting with, the particular vulnerability of caring about, something that had an ending when you were a thing that perhaps did not. But they were here now, and now was full. She had a desk in the library, a proper one, covered in papers, and Ptolemy knocked them onto the floor every morning with serene and absolute consistency, and Zarek pretended this did not amuse him, and failed increasingly convincingly. She argued with court members who needed arguing with. She translated things that had been unread for centuries, and found in them, occasionally, answers to questions the court had been debating for longer than most human civilizations had existed. She called the censured houses on procedural violations with a specificity that made even Solveth Vrain eventually show up at her door with a look of profound and reluctant respect and a request for her interpretation of a specific clause he'd been losing arguments about. She said yes. She made tea. They argued for 4 hours about a 200-year-old covenant clause, and she won, and he left looking like a man who'd lost and been glad of it. She told Zarek it at dinner, and he looked at the ceiling very briefly in a way she'd come to understand meant he was suppressing something. He respects you, he said. Solveth does not respect many things. He has spent a great deal of effort not respecting you and has failed comprehensively. It's the Prothic, she said. Everyone in this court respects someone who can out-argue them on the texts. You're all the same. He raised an eyebrow at this in a manner that was deeply aristocratic and faintly offended, and also, she had learned, meant he was delighted. I am nothing like Solveth Vrain, he said. No, she agreed. You're considerably more stubborn, and you have better furniture. He looked at her, and the smile that came to his face was the slow, full one that she'd first seen in the library very late on a night 3 weeks into her time here, the one that she was fairly certain very few people in 4,000 years had seen, and it had not become less remarkable for her familiarity with it. It's Isadora, Zarek, she said, with equal gravity. He reached across the table and took her hand, his white fingers threading through hers in the manner of someone who had decided that demonstrating what they felt was not a weakness he needed to manage, and she thought about how long it had taken him to get here, to this ease, to this openness, and she felt something warm and very full move through her chest. I want to say something, he said, and I want to say it properly. Then say it. He looked at her with all 4,000 years of himself, with the king and the ancient, and the lonely and the careful, and the new-made open thing he was learning to be, and he said, You came into an underground chamber in the dark, and you freed me, not just from the chains. Do you understand what I mean? She understood. And I intend, he said, if you are willing, to spend a very long time honoring that. She tightened her hand in his. I am willing, she said. I have been willing for considerably longer than I admitted it. So have I, he said. I simply required 3 months of evidence. Only 3 months? I am a very fast study for my age. She laughed, which was something she did often now in this place, with this person, and the sound of it in the old-world grandeur of his dining room was exactly the right sound, warm and present and unhaunted. The spring came to the city with the particular rudeness of springs that have been delayed, arriving all at once rather than gradually, and the streets above the court bloomed, and the markets filled, and Isadora stood at the window of the room that had become their room, and watched the morning she was still up to see, before the heavy curtains had to be drawn, and she thought about a graduate student in a university office 3 months. No, a year and a half ago now. A woman with a desk covered in papers and a cat and a life that had been small and organized and satisfying in the way that quiet lives sometimes were. She thought about how she had not known what she was, about how Aldrich had known and waited and prepared her and loved her and died for her in the most careful and deliberate way a person could die, giving her everything she needed and the space to need it. She thought about Zarek, asleep in the room behind her in the deep, stone-like sleep of a vampire in daytime, the white-haired impossibility of him, the king and the lonely and the ancient and the hers. She thought about what she was now, covenant keeper, translator, Isadora Kingsley of the Virani line, standing in the overlap between the human world and a world 4,000 years older, one hand in each, neither world less real than the other. She heard the sheets move. She felt his presence in the room before he reached her, that particular gravity he carried. And then his arms came around her from behind, cool and certain, and his chin rested against her temple. "You should sleep," he said. "I was watching the light." "I know." His arms tightened fractionally. "You like the light. You should see it sometime," she said. "I could tell you about it." "You already do." His voice in her ear was low and very close. "Every morning you're awake for it. You tell me what it looks like, and I remember it." She turned in his arms and looked at his face. Half in shadow, pale and exact, and entirely beloved, and she put her hand against his jaw in the way she had in the library that first time, and he closed his eyes in the same way. "The same quality of something settling, Zarek," she said. "I want you to know that I am exactly where I want to be." He opened his eyes. "As am I." A pause, and then, with a precision that was entirely deliberate, "For the first time in a very long time." She went up on her toes and kissed him, slow and certain, in the morning light from the window, in the space between two worlds that had become, somehow unmistakably, home, and in the library below. Ptolemy sat on a pile of translated Prothic manuscripts and stared at the bookshelf with perfect feline serenity, waiting, in the manner of cats throughout history, for someone to come and knock the papers off a desk. The papers could wait. In the old world chamber beneath a modern city, where blood law runes glowed in the walls of a library that held 4,000 years of history, the Vampire King, who had never once needed rescue, had discovered what it meant to be found, and the human runaway, who had spent 3 months surviving, had discovered what it meant to arrive, and, between the two of them, in the complicated and extraordinary space of what they had built together, something was growing that had no proper name in either Prothic or any modern language. Call it trust, call it devotion, call it the particular alchemy of two people who have seen each other at their most essential and chosen to stay. The court continued, the work continued. The world continued to be both the ordinary city of coffee and rain and traffic above, and the ancient blood law world below, both equally real, both equally hers. And every evening without fail, she came down the stairs of a building that had become home in ways she hadn't expected home to feel, and he was there, reading something in a language she probably could have translated by now. And there was coffee waiting, made exactly as she liked it, because he had an excellent memory, and because that was the kind of person he was, attentive in the ways that mattered, steady in the ways that mattered more. And every evening, without fail, he put the book down, and she sat across from him, and they talked until the hours became unreasonable, about the court, and the texts, and the world above, and history, and the nature of things. And it was the best conversation she had ever been in, the one that had been going for over a year now, and showed no signs of its end. Outside, the city went about its business, indifferent and luminous and full of ordinary people, with ordinary lives and ordinary loves, and in the beautiful hidden space beneath it, the vampire king who had ruled alone for millennia held the hand of the woman who had freed him, and the woman who had spent her life translating ancient things found that the oldest story of all was also improbably hers. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.